A top Pima County law enforcement officer indicted. Will it affect the election for sheriff? We'll look at a plan to save historic buildings along Broadway. A Tucson refugee represents Arizona's immigrants at a national convention. Then, the history and impact of an iconic science symbol in Tucson. This is Metro Week. This week, the second in command at the Pima County Sheriff's Department was indicted in federal court and resigned. We'll recap what led to that after a look at the latest in the week's news.
Pima County Chief Deputy Sheriff Chris Radke was arraigned in federal court today. He's charged with conspiracy to commit money laundering, which, if found guilty, has a penalty of up to 20 years in prison and a $500,000 fine. Radke is also charged with 6 counts of theft. Each count could carry up to 10 years in prison and $250,000 in fines. The committee charged with finding the next University of Arizona president met for the first time this week. Members stressed that the next president needs to be someone who can navigate the changing landscape of higher education and sell the U of A's story locally and around the world. University of Arizona President Ann Weaver Hart announced her desire to leave the office earlier this year. Tucson's aerospace industry is getting a boost. Rocket builder Vector Space System announced this week that it will open a new manufacturing plant near Tucson International Airport. Vector officials say the new facility will add more than 200 jobs and $250 million to the region's GDP in the next 5 years. The operation will build small rockets designed to launch microsatellites into orbit inexpensively. Vector is the second tenant at the Aerospace Defense and Technology Business Park established by Pima County. It will join space balloon company Worldview. And the Arizona Department of Transportation will install a dust storm warning system on Interstate 10 in Pinal County, north of Tucson. That's where blowing dust has contributed to many multi-vehicle crashes and deaths. For more on all of the week's stories, visit our website.
Sheriff's Department Chief Deputy Chris Radke resigned Monday after informing Sheriff Chris Nanos that he'd been indicted on allegations of misuse of money seized in crime investigations. Here to fill in the details is Caitlin Schmidt, the public safety reporter at the Arizona Daily Star. Caitlin, this week we actually saw that indictment. What were the charges?
There were 7 federal charges, all felonies. The first one was conspiracy to launder money, and the remaining 6 were embezzlement or theft of federal funds.
What, in layman's terms, does all of that mean?
The conspiracy charge indicates that he was involved with at least one other person to collude to take this money. The indictment specifically said persons known or unknown to the grand jury. So we know there's at least one other person involved. And the embezzlement and theft charges, what the indictment says is that they were depositing forfeited funds from criminal investigations into an auxiliary volunteers account to be used for crime-fighting efforts. And the indictment indicates that Radke and others had been withdrawing money to use for personal items.
Okay, and I'm going to back you up. Almost a whole year you started working on this story and actually uncovered some of this, or a lot of this. As short as you can, remind us what caused this, or what you think caused it.
So in late October of last year, I received a tip that there was a cafe in Sheriff's headquarters that Radke's niece was running, and another vendor had been removed so that the niece could take over. So I made a public records request to try to get the contract, and there was no contract with the county for a public building. And we found out that there were some steps missed through that, but they were able to provide me documentation for how much money had been spent to improve the cafe, and it was roughly $30,000. And from what I understand after that, people came forward to the FBI and started talking, and an investigation was opened. So this indictment showed several of the purchases were actually related to cafe items, such as a $2,000 chalkboard menu and a microwave.
And that money is that crime money seized in crime investigations?
Yes, the forfeited funds.
And your reporting can track that?
It does, absolutely.
How far back does this go? Give us sort of the timeline of that cafe, those cafe issues to today.
The cafe opened in late 2011, and the indictment, I believe, was from 2011, early 2011 through 2016. The interesting part about the indictment was the last date was February 15th of this year, and we published our story about the FBI investigation on February 11th, just a few days before.
Oh, wow.
So.
And that's the FBI investigation story you did, but the cafe story actually came out last November, almost a year ago.
Yes.
Dating back to 2011 means Sheriff Clarence Dupnick was in charge of the department at that time, and Chris Nanos was the chief deputy.
Yes.
So there's a whole different leadership change in this time period.
There is.
Okay, do we know if anybody else is going to be charged or implicated in this?
The language from the indictment would suggest that at least one other person will be the conspiracy charge, the people known and unknown to the grand jury, but it's tough to say who that will be. But there was a different leadership at the time. There were different people running different aspects of the department, finance units and whatnot, so.
Do you know if the FBI has finished the investigation or if it's still underway?
I don't. The FBI has told us throughout all of this that they don't confirm or deny the existence of investigations until they are sent to court.
So, okay, we're at step one of sending it to court.
We are.
Okay. Do you know why the case was moved from the Arizona Attorney's Office to the Utah Attorney's Office? This indictment was filed from the Utah Attorney's Office.
It was. The Arizona Attorney's Office would not tell us why they recused themselves.
Okay, again, the federal government doesn't talk a lot
That's
about these
right.
cases. Anything else that the public should know about this story as it continues unfolding this week? What might be coming? Like I said, other charges?
Things have been moving pretty quickly in the past week, I would say, so it's quite possible that we'll see additional charges, that more documents will be filed in court or unsealed. We could get some discovery that lists other financial assets that were improperly used. It's tough to say.
All right, well, we should also be really clear, as you said, this is changing very quickly, and our conversation is what we know at this point, but more could come out this week, even before the show airs. Thank you so much, Caitlin.
Thanks.
The National Trust for Historic Preservation recently named a 2-mile stretch of East Broadway one of America's 11 most endangered places. Vanessa Barchfield has an update.
The area, called the Sunshine Mile, runs between Euclid and Country Club along Broadway Boulevard. It's lined with dozens of mid-century modern buildings, a number of which would be raised by a long-planned widening of Broadway. In the works for the past 3 decades, the project would widen Broadway along that stretch to 6 lanes. Construction is expected to begin in 2018. Many supporters say delays to the city's plans have left the area in limbo, its unknown fate deterring investment along the Sunshine Mile. Opponents say traffic congestion along the stretch has not increased, so the project and resulting demolition of buildings is unnecessary. It's unknown whether the inclusion of the area on the most endangered places list will have any impact on the city's plans for Broadway. But officials from the nonprofit National Historic Preservation Trust say 95% of the sites listed since it was started in 1988 have been saved from demolition or continue to be functional.
I asked Damian Klinko of the Tucson Historic Preservation Foundation to explain the impact of the endangered designation. He joined me in the studio this week. Thanks for joining me, and I want to start by just asking you which buildings are threatened.
So there are a number of buildings that are threatened, but it's in different types of ways. We know that there are buildings that are directly impacted because they are severed by the road, but then there are dozens of buildings that are impacted with an indirect impact. And so the city plans on acquiring many buildings, and upwards of 60, but how those buildings are going to be disposed of is very unclear. So whether they get demolished for parking or for other types of land use and those remnant parcels get sold really is one of the things that we're very concerned about.
As the city figures out what it's doing, what role does that put you in?
Well, so one of the things that the 11 most designation has really sort of created an opportunity for is to adopt a series of policies that were created by Bob Vint, who is an architect here in town, who was tasked by the mayor and council when the 30% design plan for the roadway was adopted to actually look at the land use issues outside of the alignment. So his group has come up with a series of recommendations that provide a framework for really beginning to address holistically the street, because it's not just the individual buildings, it's how those buildings interact together to create a district. And it's our hope that we can really, through this process and through the widening of the road and the retention and preservation of these buildings, create an important economic corridor, something like 4th Avenue or downtown Tucson, that really becomes a destination. And this could be for shopping and for new restaurants. And already we see successes appearing on Broadway, like the Welcome Diner, which opened just a few weeks ago.
And it is the district, so to speak, as a whole, that whole stretch that is threatened?
Yeah, it's really the roadway project goes from Euclid to Country Club, and that was historically the Sunshine Mile. And so, after World War II, these buildings were built really along what became the major arterial to the suburban edge of Tucson. And along that corridor were lots of small businesses. They were, stores that sold shoes and clothing and hats, but you could also buy cars and cameras and sort of the full array of trappings for life. And those buildings present an incredible opportunity for small businesses and incubator spaces to really come up again. Along that corridor already, there are tons of small businesses that are beloved by Tucsonans up and down this stretch. That are really iconic businesses. And what we know from national studies, looking at the economics of older, smaller buildings, is that they tend to attract a stronger tax base. So if we preserve this, we're really actually planning for the future to ensure that we have a strong business community and small businesses that will then, in return, feed back to the city to be able to support our general fund and the things that we care about beyond preservation and roads.
Now, in fact, that district, that Sunshine Mile, is the heart of what is Tucson Modernism Week and Tucson's modernism architecture, which is actually still going on. Was the timing of this just serendipitous?
The timing was just serendipitous. We started Tucson Modernism Week 5 years ago because of a concern about mid-century modern architecture and Broadway. Broadway is one of the larger concentrations of mid-century modern buildings in our community, and it's one of the most intact concentrations of mid-century modern architecture of this type in the American Southwest. So it's something that's very special, it's unique, it's one of the things that makes Tucson special, and yet we are just, as a society and as a community, beginning to understand and sort of reflect and look at modern architecture as something of value. It's something from the recent past. It was built after World War II. It's something that people still have in their memories of some of these buildings being built. So it's hard to think about that as being something that's historic and something that we should be having a discussion about preserving. But this is part of a national trend all over the country that's looking at mid-century modern architecture and how that actually plays into the character and quality of life of a city, and actually tells the story of who we are as a community and the type of buildings and places that we live and shop.
To be clear, and based on one of your earlier answers, you're not opposed to the road widening. It's a matter of trying to kind of accomplish both goals at once.
Exactly. I mean, there really, I think, is an opportunity to marry these two things together. The roadway is happening. I mean, that's clear. The mayor and council voted on a 30% alignment. It's our hope now that there really will be this embrace and development of a very comprehensive land use plan that really needs to happen now. If we wait for a year or a year and a half or 2 years when we're actually in construction or after properties have been acquired and torn down, it really limits the opportunity to actually deal with this roadway and the land use issues around preservation and adaptive reuse in a real holistic and thoughtful way. So it's the Tucson Historic Preservation Foundation's commitment to work with the city to try to develop strategies for these small, what are sort of, we still call strip malls, but they're actually clusters of individually architect-designed buildings that make up many of the sections of the corridor that are prime for adaptive reuse and for becoming part of our vital economic community.
Did the foundation apply for this designation?
Yeah, so the foundation formally put in an application. I mean, we've, since the beginning of this roadway widening process, since the Citizen Task Force meeting started over 4 years ago, we have continually advocated for the dealing and addressing the land use issues around this widening and how those land use issues would impact the preservation or loss or retention of these buildings. And that hasn't been dealt with yet. And so it's really our hope that the city will look at this in a much more proactive way and say, well, let's deal with this now and not kick the can down the road and deal with it after the roadway is fully designed and the impacts, indirect impacts are occurring. Because it's not just the properties that the city will acquire. There's also an opportunity to put in place incentives and put in good, thoughtful policy that will help direct the private sector to make good choices. Already we've seen speculators buy and tear down buildings or modify buildings that are from that era, that once they're gone, they're sort of irreplaceable. And as we start to lose these buildings, we lose the fabric of the district.
Have you had any city response to the designation?
It's my understanding that the city is looking at putting Bob Vint's recommendations on the agenda in the coming months, on at least a study session item in the coming months. So again, we're really hopeful that we'll begin to have a fresh dialogue and that there really is an opportunity for partnership.
I want to shift it a little bit and just ask you for an update on one of the other threatened pieces of architecture in southern Arizona a few years ago. The historic Black Officers Club at Fort Huachuca got the same designation. What's its status today?
We're continuing to work with Fort Huachuca and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. That was after it was named one of the 11 most endangered places in America. The National Trust named it one of their national treasures. And so they have their staff, and they've brought their expertise together along with concerned citizens from Sierra Vista and Tucson to really begin to craft a plan, and are working with the Army to try to come up with some very strategic solutions that can meet Army goals while preserving the building for the future. So we're really optimistic about that project. It's not saved yet, but we are definitely on the way.
All right, Damian Klinko, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Tucson has long been a resettlement city for refugees, and the city was represented at a recent Refugee Congress in Washington, D.C. Delegates to the Refugee Congress represent their home states in the U.S. after coming to those homes from all over the world. They gather in Washington, D.C. and plan ways to advocate and bring understanding for refugees. Many now work as resources in their communities, helping others resettle, transition, and find jobs. That's what Bassam Mahmoud does. He is a Tucsonan who came to the U.S. on a special visa after he worked as a translator for international coalition forces in Iraq. He supports refugee transitions at Tucson Unified School District and was Arizona's delegate to the Refugee Congress. The delegates also represent immigrants under threat, such as asylum seekers and stateless persons. I asked Bassam Mahmoud to share more about his role as a delegate and how he came to Tucson from Iraq. Here's our interview from this week. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Let's start by having you tell us essentially how you got to Tucson, your experience in Iraq, and what brought you here.
I am originally from Iraq, Baghdad. I came to the United States in 2010, early 2010, as a special immigrant visa holder. I came with my wife and my first son. And our final destination, as they say it at the resettlement agencies, was, and it is Tucson. And since that, I have been settled in Tucson as a SIV because I was, according to my work nature, as an interpreter, translator, and a cultural advisor. And that put me under threat for more than one occasion. And that's what forced me to apply for the SIV and come to the United States.
Who were you translating for?
I worked under the umbrella of coalition forces, and a part of them is the U.S. military, because I worked in different branches like the Air Force, Marines, even military and Army. I worked with even with the civilians at the Baghdad Police College.
And so that sort of gave you a threatened status in Iraq with the rebel forces, and that's how you were able to apply for and get that special immigration visa.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I get in a different process to get the SIV, and they have to meet a major general to get his recommendation and approved to come to the United States.
Did you get to choose where you actually ended up resettling? Did you choose Tucson?
One of my friends, he used to live in Tucson, and I get his sponsorship to come to Tucson.
And since then, you just told me you've become a U.S. citizen.
Yes, ma'am, I am.
So you're not a refugee, but you did go to the Refugee Congress. First of all, who can go? Obviously, more than refugees.
It's a diversity meeting for all the refugees, immigrants, asylum seekers, or stateless personnel who came to the United States. So it's just wide open.
It's a broad group of immigrants of all different sorts, but pretty much all people who have been under threat in their home countries.
Yes, or people who's seeking a safe place to live and raise their children.
So what did you do while you were in Washington, D.C. for that Congress?
We met different people, different immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers from different states. We were been more than 50 personnel over there, and we discussed different issues that deals with the process to get approved to come to the United States, about education, about resettlement agencies, the difficulties or some obstacles that facing immigrants, refugees, and how can we facilitate that and make it easier for them to live and understand the life in the United States.
And not only as somebody who moved from Iraq to Tucson, but also you serve immigrants and refugees in the Tucson Unified School District in your job. Tell me about that.
My title with TUSD for right now, it's a community liaison, and next month I will be moving into a different position as an Arabic teacher. Wow. Yes, stay with TUSD. And we have a group of Syrian students, and my focusing right now is helping them understand that a new life in the United States. How can they blend with the new society? How can they understand? Especially, it's a brand new educational system for them, and their mother language is Arabic, and they have to understand that language is something essential for them, and it's not Arabic, it's English for right now.
So when you take the experiences you have every day at work, plus your own life experiences, what goals do you come up with as part of the Refugee Congress that all the states or the federal government need to work on?
For the resettlement agencies, their job or their goal will be ended after 3 months from the arrival for their clients, and after that they will be by themselves. So we are missing some pieces in this big picture, and I'm planning to have some steps to fix that, especially about education, about the citizenship program they can apply to and how can they study for, and some of the a new understanding about the American culture and the American life.
And so part of that is just extending that support, that period of support beyond the 3 months. That's a federal guideline, that 3 months, right?
It is a federal, yes.
So is it a request of the Refugee Congress to the federal government to extend those resources, or?
Extended these resources, and plus help these organizations to establish themselves, because as we know, they are non-profit organizations, so they depend on other personnels or other government organizations.
And community support,
yes,
wherever they are.
Yes.
So would you go back next year? Would you try to go back to the Congress?
Yes, yes, and they told me about that, and they told them I want to be there next meeting, and I have to have some good news when I come.
So you have to make some progress. What are some of the goals you really want to show progress on in the next year?
Next year is for me, it's an educational system, because some of the difficulties, especially for the newcomers to the United States, about how to process their degree, or what it means to either to process their education in the United States, where they have to go, because I have been at the same situations before, and it took me 2 years going back and forth from Pima Community College and UV to figure out what they're going to do with my degree and my education.
Wow. So that needs work on your end.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Bassam Mahmoud, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
The University of Arizona has the country's top astronomy program as measured by its grants and spending. The Powerhouse program, which encompasses solar system, star, and galaxy observations and telescope mirror fabrication, got its start quite small 100 years ago this month. Sarah Hammond reports.
A $60,000 gift made a century ago this month led to construction of an observatory with a 36-inch telescope at the far east end of the campus on what was then an ostrich farm. It was the largest private gift ever made to the 31-year-old University of Arizona at the time, and it came from Lavinia Steward, who lived in Oracle. There, she viewed the clear Arizona skies with a telescope at her home. Mrs. Steward had moved to Oracle with her nephew in 1894 and became a matron of the community. The gift in the name of Mrs. Steward's husband, Henry, allowed astronomer Andrew Ellicott Douglas to realize his dream of building an observatory at the U of A. Douglas had built an observatory in Flagstaff when he was working there under astronomer Percival Lowell. Douglas disagreed with Lowell's theory that Mars was inhabited, and Lowell fired Douglas. He then came to Tucson in 1906 to teach physics and geography at the university. For several years, he sought money for an observatory from the legislature with no success. The white-domed Steward Observatory, now nestled on the U of A campus nearly hidden among towering red brick classroom buildings, became the foundation for one of the country's top astronomy programs and has spawned several related disciplines. Its original telescope is atop Kitt Peak, where it is still used to search for approaching asteroids.
And Sarah Hammond joins us now to give us more detail. Sarah, I already learned a ton from that report. What else did you learn covering the story?
Well, first and foremost, the reason there's so much astronomy and space science and optical science here is the weather. Our clear, dark skies made it the ideal spot to do stargazing. Andrew Ellicott Douglas came to Tucson in 1906 to teach at the University of Arizona. He had worked for Percival Lowell in Flagstaff, and he wanted his own observatory here.
And that's the Lowell Observatory, and you mentioned that in the piece.
Correct.
That's also famous.
Right. Tucson was a candidate for the Lowell Observatory, but Percival Lowell chose Flagstaff instead. So the gift from Mrs. Steward allowed the observatory to be built. And astronomy work continued here throughout the years. Where the branching out began, in the late 1950s, the federal government started funding scientific research. And a man named Aidan Meinel was selected to site and build a national observatory. He chose Kitt Peak. A few years later, once Kitt Peak was up and running, he was named the director of Steward Observatory. And he ran the astronomy department, and then he founded what was called the Optical Science Center, now the College of Optical Sciences here on campus. A few years later, of course, Gerard Kuiper was recruited to come to the university to bring his moon mapping project here. And as we know, he was under the astronomy department and then founded the Lunar and Planetary Lab, which is of its own right very well known and very accomplished here. And then in the 1980s, U of A astronomer Roger Angel was experimenting with melting glass to create telescope mirrors. And that evolved into the Steward Observatory Mirror Lab, and it casts all the large telescope mirrors for telescopes all over the world. And the Mirror Lab just a couple of years ago received a very generous $20 million gift, and the lab is now named for the donor Richard Karras.
And I think I cut you off when you mentioned Mr. Douglas. What did he do at the U of A?
So Andrew Ellicott Douglas came here to teach physics and math and astronomy, and then subsequently he was an interim president of the university for a few months. He was the dean of the College of Arts, Letters, and Science. And then his final contribution, the connection is that he founded the discipline of dendrochronology, or the study of tree rings. And of course, now we have the famous tree ring laboratory here. So there's a lot of connections and a lot of branching out from that gift and our Steward Observatory.
And of course, anybody who takes a walk on the U of A campus will see buildings named after a lot of the people that you just mentioned, because they did have such a big impact on the campus, on the development of the U of A.
Absolutely, and their legacies continue.
What do we know about the economic impact when you add all of this up?
So in 2006, the Eller College conducted an economic impact study of the state's astronomy, planetary research, and optics industry. And obviously the biggest driver, the biggest contributor to that is the activities at the University of Arizona. And at that time, the economic impact was measured at more than $250 million. That's before the university got the OSIRIS-REx mission and a number of the mirrors that they're casting. So I would guess the impact is a lot greater. Steward Observatory alone has 400 employees. It has telescopes all around us, of course, on Mount Bigelow and Mount Lemmon in the Catalinas, Mount Hopkins down in the Santa Ritas, and that's a partnership with the Vatican and the Harvard and the Smithsonian. Of course, Kitt Peak, there are U of A telescopes there. The Large Binocular Telescope on Mount Graham. And there was a small telescope on the lawn of the Steward Observatory, which is now on Tumamoc Hill. So there are representations of Steward all over the area.
Yeah, that legacy then is all on all the mountains all around us.
Yeah, right.
So you mentioned it's the 100th-year anniversary of that financial gift.
Right.
Are there any events going on that help honor that, or the public can come to?
Absolutely. One of the things that Andrew Ellicott Douglas did when the observatory was completed in the fall of 1922 was open it to the public. And he used to conduct public evenings, so an astronomer would talk about his or her research, and then folks would go up to the telescope and view the sky. That tradition has continued with the exception of the war years, 1942 to 1945. And next Monday, October 17th, is a special event to mark the anniversary of Mrs. Steward's gift. Instead of a lecture, Steward will premiere a new 25-minute film produced by Michael Mulcahy and Peter Baudère of the School of Theater, Film, and Television, and it's a history of the Steward Observatory. Then there will be a panel discussion following, and then keeping with the tradition, folks can go up the stairs and view the sky through the 21-inch telescope. That event starts at 7:30 in the Steward Auditorium, and there's some overflow available in nearby classrooms, and there will be cake to mark the anniversary.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
You're welcome.
That's it for us. Next week, we'll look at the county's effort to balance land development and environmental conservation. Thanks for watching.